The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in alliance with Jindal Steel and Power Limited and Indraprastha Polo Hospitals, airline partner SpiceJet.
For decades now, I've bought copies of A Good Life. That is the memoir of Benjamin Bradley, the legendary editor of The Washington Post, and also acknowledged to be among the greatest editors of all times. Watergate, Pentagon, all those stories happened under his watch. And I give copies of those to reporters who do great stories. Now, to add to that, we also have a memoir, a journalistic memoir or editorial memoir by the greatest editor of our times in India by far. And I say that, Arun, knowing that that might draw me some objections and some comments and some grievances from here and there. But
they'll say this is all a mutual admiration society.
Well, also to let, Arun, I never worked with you. I never had the honor of working with you directly in your office. You just picked me from Chandigarh and sent me to the Northeast and then did the biggest favor in my life.
Indeed, and I remember you are telling me so how much we knew about the Northeast at that time. That the one man who used to look after all the accounts was the PC
Jain. Yes.
He asked you, कि भी मैं तेरी आपकी सैलरी किस तरह रुपीस में बेचनी है?
नहीं, उसने कहा जी ये आपकी सैलरी कौन से सिक्के में जाएगी? शिलोंग के अंदर.
ये रुपी में जाएगी या फॉरेन करेंसी?
फॉरेन करेंसी.
And that was our state of knowledge of the Northeast, and you brought it home to us.
Okay, so thank you very much, and I'm eternally grateful for two things. One, besides many other things, I've owed you so many things, but two big things: sending me to the Northeast and then advising me to join India Today in 1983. And those are the two turning points. But you know, there's so many journalists in India of my vintage who owe so much to Arun, because Arun was the first editor in India who believed in young people and who trusted them. Arun, remember something you once said? That I trust my reporters like I can give them the keys and go to sleep.
Like Gundu Rao.
आपने ट्राई नहीं किया कभी? नहीं तो हम पता नहीं क्या करते.
अलमारियां खाली ने.
अलमारियां खाली. So, describe the scene of journalism when you came into it serendipitously.
Yes, absolutely by accident. And many good things to me have happened by accident. And by meeting my wife and everything. And in this case also, but the question about journalism at that time, that all these popes and sub-popes sitting at the top, they were only writing essays, and probably addressing an audience which they thought was British audience. And secondly, those persons who were regarded as persons with great scoops, they were only reporting what they were told. They had some source in the Defense Ministry or External Affairs Ministry, and that source की जो कही हुई बात उसको बहुत बड़ा scoop बन जाता था. But I felt that what you did, what others did, was that we should go to the field and report from there. That was your great strength. All the Delhi reporters, I mean, if there's a riot, then it's not that you should sit here and editorialize and write about it, but you should actually go there. And the photographs that R.K. Sharma or our Chopra used to bring,
right?
Those brought everything in front of you. So that was the great change, I think, at that time, and that certainly required that we should have give great prominence to those who take the risk and the trouble to go into the field.
Yes. And not just out of Delhi, there was N.K. Singh in Bhopal.
Yes. Arun Sinha in...
He broke a great story,
yes,
which we talk about.
Yes.
Arun Sinha in Bihar.
Yes. Ashwani Sareen.
Bhagalpur blindings.
Yes, Ashwani
Sareen in Delhi. And then so many of us. Kumi Kapoor, Rahul Bedi.
Yes.
Sudeep Majumdar.
Yes.
All of us became bylines.
And also that they went into the, on the ground. Then the second change, I think, was that at that time, remember, of course, if you look at the layout of those days, it was very different from all the things that you are able to do now. But also that the visual aspect was not given much prominence. So we started using large photographs. The cartoons became larger, not just Abu's, but Ravi Shankar's. And that also was quite, things that were objected to.
Yeah. So when you walked into this environment filled with popes and archbishops and Shankaracharyas and ayatollahs or grand muftis, whatever you call them, to be secular, how did they deal with the shock? They must have seen you as an upstart.
Yes. And probably they were right. I was an upstart. And then, so the usual thing is that he's not a journalist, he's a pamphleteer, and things of this kind. But that would not affect.
But you were also too well educated to be an editor.
Yes, there's in this book I've reproduced what Girilal Jain, as representative of the popes, said. You know that this chap who has not had anything to do with the freedom struggle.
Right.
had to do with the freedom struggle. We have seen your freedom struggle during the emergency. But anyhow, they were the persons who used that kind of adjectival putting down. And there were many others who tried to do this within the paper, because the paper was really Ramnathji, and you had just to go on and dripping water into his ear. And that was always a problem.
Yeah. And did you face a pushback then from the establishment or the ancient regime that, why you're breaking all the rules, you're upsetting the hierarchy?
Yes, certainly that was the case. That was the common talk at the lunch table with Ramnathji sitting there. But at that time, Ramnathji always stood by you till he dismissed you. So he would say, "Nahi, isko karne do." And he was also very proud of the fact that new stories are coming out, young reporters are doing it. So why are you so upset about young reporters getting byline? Is that the issue? Or the issue is
and that had become an issue.
Yes, the issue is they are doing such good stories. That's the issue. Is the story good or not? But tum ye byline par itne cheekh rahe ho. But that was their reaction.
In fact, there's a line in the book from Ramnathji where he says कि अभी जो नया है जो कर रहा है करने दो, right? जो कर रहा है करने दो. And then his temperament, I never worked with him directly. I might have had a few encounters with him as a junior reporter in Chandigarh when he used to come there. And when I was being sent to the Northeast, I think somebody took me to meet him कि रामनाथ से मिलो तुम Northeast जा रहे हो. So he sat on his sofa and he asked me to bend. So I wasn't quite sure what he was asking me to do. So I bent. He said, "Aur jhuko." Then I bent more. Then I bent more. I was wondering what does he want. Then he held my ear. And he said, "Northeast jao, produce a lot of good stories and no babies." So he had his own sense of life. And of course, our first one was born in Shillong.
Yes.
He was a character. So how did you deal with this person of such a mercurial temperament? Aaj upar, aaj niche.
It was not that difficult to deal with him. I think because he was also very conscious of the results that were coming about in the paper because of the work of all of you. That was the armor, so to say. That the work is good, it is being talked of, it is having results in the Supreme Court, in other courts. So I'm sure that even in his circle, they would be aapke paper mein ye chapa hai, like that. So I don't think that was...
So he'd be proud of it.
He'll be proud of it. I think that was one point. And second, none of you think about it. He would be very conscious that we ज़्यादा expense तो नहीं हो रहा. None of you were expensive. And in those days,
in fact, I joined in 1977 at 600 rupees.
Yes. And he never gave 50 rupees for advertisement.
Right.
So you use that. Of course, the paper was always in financial difficulties because of the kind of management of this thing. But he just wouldn't give it. मुझे याद है उन दिनों में बिल्कुल बड़ी चीज़ होती थी कि भाई DTC के बस के पीछे वो एडवर्टीजमेंट लगा सकते थे, है ना, एक्सपेंस. तो वो बहुत इनएक्सपेंसिव था क्योंकि दिल्ली में तो बट इट वाज सच अ फाइट टू गेट दैट डन. बट so the stories were coming. They were not costing the paper much in terms of financial expenses. So,
and he could kick up an almighty drama in front of others, like your Shekhar story.
Shekhar story, Justice Bhagwati's story.
Justice Bhagwati's story.
Yes, he would do a big drama. Yes.
So, tell us about the Shekhar story in a minute.
तो उनका फोन आता है, जल्दी आओ, एकदम आओ, तुरंत आओ. So I go there to his room. I have just entered the room in this very building there. I just entered the room. He starts shouting, ये तुम्हारे बाप का पेपर है, तुम्हारा पेपर है, तुम्हारे पैसे जाएंगे. मैंने कितनी बार तुम्हें कहा कि चंद्रशेखर जी का आदमी वो बलिया में स्ट्रिंगर लगाना है.
बलिया उसका होम टाउन था.
चंद्रशेखर, उसमें स्ट्रिंगर लगाना है. अरे तुम्हारे पैसे जाते थे, तुम्हारे बाप के पैसे जाते, तुमने क्यों नहीं लगाया, अभी तक क्यों नहीं लगाया. And it went on. And Chandrasekhar thought that this Ramnath ji is so upset, he may fire me on this. He said, नहीं Ramnath ji वो छोटी बात है और अरुण तो मेरा मित्र है, वो तो हो जाएगा जी है वो, बैठो चाय पियो. So this went on. Then the conversation went to the other things, and then I got up. Chandrasekhar got up, so I went down to the steps for him to see him.
The same building.
In the same building, to see him off. Ramnath said, वापस आ जाना. Okay. Again I went. इस के कहने पर किसी को तुमने रिक्रूट किया, कहीं अपॉइंट किया, मैं तुम्हें निकाल दूंगा, कल निकाल दूंगा. देखो एक चीज सुनो, जब तुम्हें मुश्किल पड़े तो मेरे कुर्ते पर हाथ पहुंच देना कि भी रामनाथ नहीं करने देता. मुझे मुश्किल पड़ेगी, मैं कह दूं, मैं तुम्हारी कमीज पर हाथ पहुंच दूंगा और मेरी बात नहीं मानता. So these were his guru mantras in all things.
Yeah, and the Bhagwati story?
Bhagwati story was a very big thing. You see, what happened was, Justice Bhagwati was the presiding judge over in a very famous case on the transfer of judges.
Right.
In which he did what I felt that he had given the key to the robber. Yeah. He gave the key to the executive, that the executive has the right, and it was a convoluted, long judgment that he had written. So, in those days, our Bombay edition was closed. Ramnath ji was in Bombay.
Because there must have been a strike those days.
So, contrived strike. Contrived strike. So I wrote, I did not know typing at that time, so I wrote longhand a 3-part article on Justice Bhagwati's judgment.
Can you type now?
I can now type because I don't have the money to have a steno. I don't have the money to have a steno, so I've learnt that. So I wrote the article, but the first part came out, and Ramnath ji rang up from Bombay कि भाई ये क्या हो रहा है, दिल्ली में क्या हुआ है कि भाई वो भगवती फोन पर फोन किए जा रहे हैं, तुम इधर आ जाओ. So I went to him. So he asked me in the morning कि भाई क्या हुआ. मैंने कहा जी बात ये है कि मैंने उस पर आर्टिकल लिखे, उसकी जजमेंट पर आर्टिकल लिखे, वो छप गया. मैं कहा जी एक पार्ट छप गया था कल, एक पार्ट आज सुबह छप गया होगा वहाँ दिल्ली में, और कल तीसरा पार्ट आएगा. यहाँ लाए हो? मैंने कहा जी लाया हूँ, आपके लिए लाया हूँ. तो आई गिव हिम द टाइप्ड कॉपी. ही सर अच्छा तुम अपनी कॉफ़ी पियो, मैं पढ़ता हूँ. आफ्टर दैट ही कॉल्ड मी. ही सेड कि जो तुमने लिखा है ये मेरे दोस्त के बारे में लिखा है, मगर जो लिखा है विच इज़ अनआंसरेबल. बिल्कुल ठीक है, और वो मुझे मिलने आ रहा है. ठीक है, कब आ रहा है? से अभी आ रहा है फ्लाइट में. तो आई रियली थॉट कि जज इज कमिंग टू बॉम्बे टू मीट रामनाथ जी. एनी हाउ दैट इट्स अ प्रॉब्लम. ही सर कि तुम ऐसे करना, उनके वो 2 बेडरूम साइड पर थे, एक उनका बेडरूम था और यहाँ बड़ा कमरा था वेयर ही वुड मीट पीपल. ही सर वो यहाँ आएगा, तुम अपने बेडरूम में रहो, वो दरवाज़ा मुझे खोल कर रखना, सुनते रहना, मगर बाहर नहीं आना जब तक वो चला नहीं जाए. So when Bhagwati comes and Ramnath ji is all, अरे जाओ नाइस वंडरफुल, कैसे आ गए ये वो. So then Bhagwati told him कि जी ये एक आर्टिकल लिखा है अरुण शौरी. कहाँ? टाइम्स ऑफ इंडिया में? I dismiss him just now. क्यों? It's not in the contract. He cannot write. There is no contract. There is nothing. He cannot write in any other paper. वो कहते नहीं एक्सप्रेस में लिखा. एक्सप्रेस में? और मेरे पेपर में मेरे दोस्त के मेरे मित्र के बारे में ऐसे लिख दिया. क्या लिखा है? So he put on such an act that Bhagwati probably thought he will have a heart attack. So Bhagwati was pacifying him. No, nothing, no problem. This, that, and this. Just a comment. And what should I do with him? I dismiss him just now, but everybody will say I've done it for you, judge. This is the problem. How to dismiss? What should I do with him? So then it was decided that Bhagwati will send a response, and that the paper will publish. So this was the beginning when Bhagwati went to the chalo copy piyo.
By that time, I'm sure Bhagwati was saying, "ज़्यादा मत कुछ कर देना उसको."
मेरा नाम ना खराब. But there were, of course, there was a sequel to that story. Yesterday, somebody was accusing me day before at the Express that why don't you respect privacy? You reveal private conversations and what happened. But actually, there are many things which I have not mentioned. For instance, there was a sequel to this story, but which I have not mentioned. And so there were many. I mean, actually, one of the things about him, you were asking about working with him, is that every day was an adventure. And every day was a new adventure. उसमें वो आपको डांटेंगे भी, शाउट भी करेंगे, वो कुछ करने भी देंगे. So it was a thrill.
Yeah. In fact, I remember at one of the meetings with the staff in Chandigarh, he said that somebody said that you haven't confirmed us, you're extending our probation. So his answer was that as long as, you know how he used to speak, as long as you are on probation, you are like my sons. Once I confirm you, you become my sons-in-law.
Then you will be demanding.
Plus, anytime you asked him for more salary, because he used to pay your pittance, he'd say, all of you should pay me for the freedom I give you to have fun working.
No doubt.
So you had struggles with him over money for us?
And I think the only time, actually, no, it was just a complaint to him, not a struggle. And for instance, on travel allowance, there will be very little probably, you can't take a vehicle, you have to go by the bus or things of this kind. But the time in which we had 3 persons decided to work on him was that there used to be those wage board awards at that time.
Right.
And Palekar award had come. And then I. Mahadevan, who was the editor of a very famous IAS officer, he was at that time the editor of Dinmani, of the Tamil paper of the Indian Express, Dinmani. And Gurumurthy and I, we worked and persuaded Ramnath. Ramnath had a reputation that he would not implement these, and so on. But he at once agreed, actually, and he was the first to announce that he will implement the Palekar Award. So that was not the struggle.
So let me leapfrog eras. You dealt with the establishment at that point, Congress establishment, VP Singh establishment, and also establishment within the organization, that is the owner. How has the nature of establishment, of the establishment changed now? How easy, would it be easier to deal with today's establishment? Tougher? In what way has it changed?
Oh, it will be much tougher. Firstly, there was not that. Today, there are absolute links in what you call the establishment. It is one establishment. It's not the media versus the politician versus the opposition. It is one establishment. It was not the case at that time. Ramnaji himself personified that. He was not really a part of that establishment. And second thing is that there was a sense of shame, of reticence. We may think that Ramnaji was not responsive to what other people may say, but certainly Mrs. Gandhi, I did not know Rajiv Gandhi at all, but even him, I think, she sensed some sense of remorse or shame. Mrs. Gandhi may have felt remorse of Blue Star. But today there is no remorse. It's one of the features of this government. No regret, no remorse, no sense of shame, no sense that what I have done has hurt anybody else, whether it is demonetization or it was that sudden lockdown when those migrant workers had to work, to go, or the falsification of data, whether it is on GDP or it is on COVID deaths. There's no shame. But there, even if some small thing was done, it would be. They would be.
So many of the players you've known in the past. Mr. Modi also you've known in the past when he was in Gujarat. Rajnath Singh was present when you filed your nomination papers for Rajya Sabha, where you mentioned quite deliciously that one MLA had not signed his name. Now I'm not sure the way Rajya Sabha elections happen, whether it was deliberate or an oversight, who knows. Kalyan Singh was there. So you've known all these characters. Have they surprised you over time?
I think one is that the quality of persons in public life, as in professions like the civil service, that the quality has deteriorated really dramatically in the last 30, 40 years. Civil servants, I'm the son of a civil servant, but today you would not respect many of them. But at that time, these were distinguished people who would stand their ground. Take an example, visible example like Mr. B.K. Nehru. When he's governor of Kashmir, he gives an advice that you should not do this about Farooq Abdullah's dismissal, and Mrs. Gandhi, who's his cousin, does not listen to him, and she transfers him to Gujarat. But he does not change his advice.
Yes, and later in Assam, he's the one who said withdraw this curfew because nobody is following this curfew.
No, that was Mr. L.P. Singh, is it? Or that was L.P. Singh.
L.P. Singh. Okay.
He rescinded the curfew which he had imposed himself from Shillong.
Yeah, and he said if you open... No, sorry, I got mixed up. B.K. Nehru also wrote to Mrs. Gandhi about her hyper-socialist policy.
Yes,
and he said time has now come to increase production.
Yes. So, they were Mr. L.K. Jha, who was her principal secretary, Shastriji's, they would stand their ground. You can't say that today. So, in all professions, and certainly most visibly in politicians, that is one change that has happened. Second, there are now these incestuous relationships between different parts of what you call the establishment. And therefore, it is very difficult for independent journalism to come about. Maybe for judgments, there are always, you have to see the judgment and its effect one way or the other to see that it has some collateral influence.
So moreover, what's worse than judgments having not sounding good enough is just a simple ploy of not taking up a case. For example, this anonymous electoral bonds. Now I see a story today that CJI has said that he'll take it up. But this has been going on for 3 years now.
Yes, the same thing on CAA, the same thing on Article 370 and so on. Yes, you just don't take it up.
Just don't take it up. And you have a message to today's judges?
Yes, please see the consequences of both taking up cases, not taking up cases, or being influenced by any other consideration than the merits of the arguments and of the facts. And second is that please look at the facts. Don't just go by legalisms. I mean, you can, supposing, for how many days? Actually, it is probably, if somebody were to do a story today, he would remind us of our youth. कि जी अरावली हिल्स में
माइनिंग हो रही है.
अच्छा, कितनी बार फोटो छपी है, कुछ नहीं करते. अरे यार, एक बार खुद जाकर देख ही लो ना, नो प्रॉब्लम. सेम थिंग कि भाई हाउसेज वहाँ बने हैं या नहीं बने हैं, वो खड़े हैं, देख लो एक बार. So look at the facts, examine the facts, and therefore I would think that please, that is one point. Third, and therefore, as no human being can be an expert in so many things, and the judges have to deal with such a variety of issues, that it is probably necessary for them to do on a much larger scale what they do rarely, but sometimes they do it, that is seek the counsel of experts. Call them in. Everybody would want to assist the courts. So do that. And fourth, also, I think that look at the meta consequences of your judgments, the great consequences.
Please explain this.
You see, not the judgment that you are going to give is going to not affect just that particular case. It is going to have an influence over many things.
Right.
And in some of my books, I've quoted their judgments, in which they have got so carried away by their rhetoric that rhetoric will have many consequences in the future for the principles that were involved. But us time per move, the flow of words was such that the stenographers
I know,
were
because
available.
judges don't realize sometimes that whatever they write will be quoted tomorrow.
And will become, and on these days, especially because of this headline jurisprudence, you just look at the marginal note, or you just look at you take 3 sentences from a judgment and use that as the sort of peg on which to hang your argument. So certainly the judiciary needs to examine its own work quite a lot. And the delays, etc., are very important. Not taking up cases. And also, please look at the subordinate judiciary as to what is happening, or the institutions that have been set up, the regulatory institutions that have been set up in India. They are manned by judges, but you just see what is happening to this bankruptcy code.
Right.
It is 90 days में fees hogi, and 3 years the case is going on.
And similarly, arbitration cases, they go on and on.
And then what happens in the end?
In the end, somebody challenges in the court.
So you have to see how these are all authorities working under you, in a sense. This is the judicial and the parajudicial system. So you must exercise, that would be another suggestion to them, please exercise your supervisory jurisdiction.
And post-retirement jobs?
No, I don't think they should be taken. And that is why there are some very good examples of people who did not take up. Justice Tulsapurkar at that time, Justice Rohinton Nariman just now, he said, I will not take up any post-retirement jobs. So there are good examples, but many persons then look for what they would do after they are a particular age. So I think that would be certainly...
Well, people, we can't talk about everything in the limited time of this interview, so please read this book. There is a lot of interesting and important stuff and very prescient stuff about the judiciary, because among the many things Arun did and taught us was also to learn to deal with the judiciary. Many names that you know feature here, the big names of Indian judiciary, both among the judges and lawyers, Sirwai, Nariman, they are all there. And also Ramnath is sitting on the floor arranging cyclostyle sheets.
Yes.
These days it's tough to explain to people what is cyclostyle sheets. But much before we had our scanners, you had to print copies, you had to cyclostyle them.
Yes. Judges both in high and low.
Right.
In there.
Right. So you had two...
And that was actually one of the new things at that time, for which there was a lot of objection. That was that I don't know if you remember, at that time, the judgments were not analyzed in detail.
Right.
Certainly not in newspapers.
Right.
But
order was...
But order could be, it went in Shekhar's favor or it went in Arun's favor. But here we started analyzing the judgments.
Sir, you wrote that series, Flip, Flop, Flip.
Yes. This is Bhagwati's judgment.
Bhagwati, yes.
And it was on that Justice Bhagwati got so upset. And especially because he had, I had sought an appointment with him before writing it. And he was kind enough as a sitting judge to say, yes, you come, I'll discuss my judgment with you. So he discussed and gave me the reason. And I told him, sir, but this makes it, this contradicts what you have said in such and such judgment. He called for that judgment. He said, okay, actually that, and next day what happened was, in the court, in the open court, he said that the stenographer skipped some paragraphs which I had dictated. So here is the addendum. And so I went back to him and said, sir, this makes it much worse. So I wrote all this up. And my great thrill at that time was that Mr. Sirwai, the great constitutional scholar, in his 3-volume work on the Constitution of India, quotes this article, this set of articles, and the fact that Justice Bhagwati gave me the time, and then the addendum came, and then I said this. He has narrated that in his book.
So, you had 2 dismissals from the Express. Now, first of all, your life would have been less eventful and this book would have been less fun if those 2 dismissals had not taken place.
Yes.
So that I just thought about, in fact, the other day while recording a conversation with G.R. Vishwanath, the former cricketer, whose greatest innings was 97 not out. And I asked him, do you have regrets that you didn't complete 100? He said, no, if I had completed 100, nobody would have remembered that innings.
Oh.
We won that match. It was an innings played on a very tough pitch against a very strong bowling. More than half the runs of the team scored. So everybody remembers it as Vishwanath's great innings of 97 not out where he couldn't complete 100. So do you sometimes think that Ramnathji also did you a big favor by adding these 2 knocks to your life? Since life is a school of hard knocks.
Yeah. But see, firstly, in the first case, he dismissed me. Second case, as I mentioned,
Yes. You think that he didn't, it was people acting in his name.
In his name, people outside the paper who were trying to take over the paper and use his grandsons, who were very young at that time, to acquire the paper. They must have drafted that whole long teleprinter message of probably 10 takes, as they used to say in those
10
days.
takes.
10, 11 takes at that time.
I have to explain this to today's viewers. In old days, when teleprinter paper rolls used to keep printing, you tore it off after each section, like this from the teleprinter machine. That was called a take. And you didn't send a long message in one take, because if it gets garbled, you have to type the whole thing again.
Yes.
So you cut it into 10 takes.
So it was a long message, and he was not in a position at that time, mentally and physically, to be able to dictate anything of that length or that order and that coherence. Yeah, so it was not. But on the first time, yes, he had to succumb to unbearable government pressure to remove me, and by a particular date to remove me, because
There was a state bank issue.
there was an issue that would become very difficult for him. I think it was State Bank, or there was some case coming up, or maybe involving loans from the
Yes.
State Bank. And if I am not removed by then consequences would follow. But you are right. We should look upon these things as that when difficulties come our way, we must put them to work. And in retrospect, that yes, you see, at that time, if you see, maybe if I had continued, I would have been doing more of the same. But this jolt and sort of being derailed, taken out of this bogie and thrown out, means that then you have to get onto some other train. You have to do something new, else. And that dismissal I had nothing to do. It led me to write books, but I didn't have money to...
Is this your 30th?
28th, I think.
28th.
But that was one. I learned how to publish books myself. But then I did not have money for, just daily living. Ramnathji would not give you anything if a parting shot or parting is severance pay or nothing like that. And it is Tavleen who told me, कि नहीं तू column शुरू कर. मैं भी column लिख दी है. Her column was probably in 50-60 papers wherever. And कि वो cricketer,
Kapil he set up a syndicate. They features.
And Lokesh
Sharma was running
it. And so they were kind enough to take my column, distribute it to papers, and that kept us going for some time. Then eventually I got a second job, a temporary job in the Times of India. It lasted very little time because that was a...
So उसमें एक incident हुआ था, which I don't know if you remember. When I had come to meet you once, you had invited me for lunch, the Times of India office, and you had a police guy outside, your guard, because then you had these armed police guards with you all the time. And he sort of saluted me and let me go in. So I told you, I said, आप अपनी security का ध्यान नहीं रखते. मैं आया, गार्ड ने मुझे आने दिया, पूछा नहीं, उसको मुझे रोक के पूछना चाहिए था. तो आपने बुला के गार्ड को थोड़ा डांट दिया. अरे वो अभी आए हैं और आपने उनको पूछा ही नहीं, आपको पूछना चाहिए था. वो तो हो गया. तो गार्ड ने कहा नहीं सर, ये तो जरा ऐसे बाएं बुएं मोड़ी हुई थी, मुझे मैं समझा कोई पुलिस ऑफिसर ही है. तो आपने कहा नहीं ऐसे नहीं, आप सबका ध्यान रखा करो. सो आफ्टर अबाउट 10 minutes we had a very sort of disheveled looking Sameer Jain walk in. And he said, Arun, आपके गार्ड ने मुझे रोक दिया और पूछा कि तुम कौन हो?
Your viewers must know that Shekhar's memory is much sharper than mine. So you must, apart from reading my book, you must press him to write a book about all things that he remembers.
Actually, his book has reminded me of, brought back to me so many stories, because we've also had a shared journey in so many ways. And there is so much to learn from you. In fact, I thought I'll save it up for the conclusion, but I will say it now, that any time I was in trouble, I was really stressed in whichever job I was in, and I was stressed often enough. And I'd go to Arun, and Arun would tell me, work is the most therapeutic thing.
That and the other Spanish proverb that living well is the best revenge.
The best revenge. So in fact, when Arun came to our newsroom,
I was so delighted.
He looked around.
I really tell you, I'm so delighted to be here to see this wonderful setup that you have created, and you and your colleagues, young colleagues, have created. It's just wonderful. And I read the print and you have really set up something for the future. So it is a good thing to be derailed from time to time.
Absolutely.
But you must get up and start working.
Actually, it's important to be derailed also.
Yes.
Otherwise, remember that old line that you become a potted plant because you begin to vegetate.
That is one. The second point is that potted plants can't draw water on their own. They have to be watered by somebody else. If you are a tree outside, maybe you can draw water on your own. And third is that, you see, if you keep doing the same thing, and supposing you do great breakthrough stories, Northeast in Shekhar Gupta's case, then actually there is a psychological compulsion to go on living up to the reputation which you have unjustly acquired. Or justly acquired.
You mentioned the case of Ashwani Sareen.
And therefore, that itself becomes a great pressure. So somebody knocks you out, well, that pressure is gone. Now you can begin again.
So Ashwani Sareen, once again, for today's generation of viewers, he was a stellar reporter who also wrote, investigated a brilliant story under Arun's watch, the purchase of Kamla, a woman from Madhya Pradesh. That was to expose the racket in trafficking of young women from Madhya Pradesh. And that entire story is described in detail in this book.
And he also did a story in the sense that he got himself arrested in Tihar jail.
Yes.
And he exposed the drugs going on in the jail. So they were all these people.
Sir, आजकल तो खतरा है. आजकल if you get arrested, maybe you will not come out. No court will give you bail.
No, but the other problem is that you may not get arrested and they may plant drugs on you.
हाँ,
so वे भी मुश्किल है.
प्रॉब्लम हो जाएगी. एक्चुअली ड्रग ही कर रहा था.
उसी उन दिनों में होता था सिंपल कि भी यूपी में किसी को पकड़ा गया, क्या निकला जी कि एक तमंचा 4 कारतूस. अब तो देर
पंजाब में आधा किलो अफीम होती थी.
अच्छा.
So there are many stories like that. There's also, among which I consider the greatest story done, 2 greatest stories done in Indian journalism. One was on the state of under trials in India's jails, and the second was Bhagalpur blindings.
Yes.
And you mentioned after Bhagalpur blindings, the case of that blind people's march from Jantar Mantar. So tell us a little bit more about that.
You know, that what happened was this Bhagalpur blindings was going on. And Arun Sinha had exposed that with the help of a jailer, in fact, at that time, Das.
Right.
I think. And then, so we had published a big photograph of just the eyes of the person one of the persons who had been blinded. Yes. And the blind.
These were people who were called hardened criminals and said, इनको हम punish नहीं कर सकते, we can't convict them, so blind them.
Blind them and blind वो जो जिससे
with acid.
नहीं वो पहले जो बोरी से the gunny sack उसको जो स्टिच किया जाता था, उसकी नीडल लंबी नीडल होती थी, उसके साथ वो डॉक्टर उनके आंखें कर देता था perforate. And in that, he would then pour the acid. This was the technology that was employed at that time. And all this was documented and photographs were taken. So we published that photograph. And people said, this was terrible. Mrs. Gandhi was physically sick. And she herself said, I was physically sick. तो जी क्या, you made the Prime Minister physically sick. Somebody in the office said कि भी मेरा breakfast खराब हो गया, तुमने फोटो क्यों छापा, फोटो की क्या जरूरत थी, etc. But the point after that was, after all this thing about the blinding, some poor chaps who were blind, they were taking a procession to Mrs. Gandhi just that the assurances given to them in the previous meeting should be implemented, and only 2 or 3 of them were to go to this goddess to see her, and they were lathi charged. So you can imagine if you are blind and you are
and some fell in the gutters and drains.
Yes, and it was. I said that was a show of mercy, because last time the same thing had happened in the previous year, and those poor persons had fallen in the gutter on that road leading up to the Prime Minister's house. So we are a heartless, many ways such a heartless people, and we have this art of non-seeing. We don't see
what we don't want to see,
and we have a very an amnesia that you can turn on with the switch. You just forget it, erase it.
There was a certain conservatism which was maybe all deliberate and convenient. For example, in a communal riot, you will not mention the communities.
Yeah.
Then you will see people of one community attack the people of another community.
Yeah.
And one of my personal grievances, and unfortunately you had left the Express the first time by then, was when I sent pictures of the Delhi massacre, because I had a camera. So I broke the story, but I had the pictures, and those pictures even included an old man with a child with his entrails hanging out, and the old man trying to push them in. And those pictures are never used, because the editors then thought that these pictures clearly identified the victims by their faith, and they might be provocative.
But you see, it is idiotic. Hate speeches are allowed. They are all given by one person from one community about another community.
That's today.
But you can't mention the community. It is nonsense. So this type of, and we think that we have done some great service, or we have stood up for some principle, because we are this cosmetic arrangement in which you would not mention the community's name. But the real thing would be if you prosecute the characters and punish them. That we don't do. So these are just.
So, sir, how do you respond to headlines these days? Kabhi halal meat ke upar. Have you ever checked whether your meat is halal or?
Kisi ne nahi.
Kisi ne nahi.
But these are not issues. These are not real concerns of anybody. These are contrived issues, and you see that these are coming up only before the elections. And there's a technique to it. Election UP mein ho raha hai.
Hijab Karnataka mein ho raha hai.
But then use the media to blow up the issue so that it resonates in UP. अच्छा, लव जिहाद कितनी बड़ी बात थी, वो खत्म हो गया क्या?
खत्म, हाँ.
उस समय इलेक्शन में काम था. सिमिलरली ये क्या कहते हैं, killing cows for beef,
cow slaughter.
But some people were killed at that time for this. 4 or 5 individuals, those cases became big cases. Nothing happened in prosecution, but it served the purpose at that time to remind people of this, to remind people of the other, it is the jo beef khata hai. So these are all contrivances, and I am unfortunately, this is what Hinduism is being reduced to. The whole thing, a religion which was all about the inner search, in which the only criterion was spiritual, direct spiritual experience, has now been reduced to these things. Have you beaten up that Bengal seller in Indore or not? And if you are beaten up, you are me Tarzan. So that is what is happening now, and it will be the end of Hinduism as a great spiritual tradition.
You've done a deep study of Hinduism, and you've also spent time with RSS people. There is a delicious reference to one of those meetings, I think with Bhaurao Devaras. So I'll have you recount that story. But how do they then relate to this turn in Hinduism?
No, but this is their Hinduism.
So they haven't made the deep study of...
No, I don't think so.
the philosophy?
No, and I've mentioned this. I think it is our fault of our generations, or maybe the 2-3 generations, and of English educated people, and actually of everybody else also, that other than a very small section of the communists, nobody has studied the primary literature of the RSS. Then they would have realized that it is not that inner directed search which they see as the essential point about Hinduism.
It's superficial.
It is superficial. It is it is propagandist. It is sloganistic. It is finding such things which can be used to define the other.
But you spent time with them. You got to know them closely. Did you ever have any shastrarth on this with them?
Not really. I didn't get to know them very well. I think for that you will have to talk to Guru Murthy and others. But yes, I should have got to know them better.
Yeah. We know that when you were disinvestment minister, they didn't quite like you.
Yes.
Because they were more left than the leftists.
Of course.
And they continue to be in many ways.
Yes.
Yeah. So we've seen institutions change. First of all, you tell us that story about your meeting with Bhaurao Devras.
Yeah, I got a call.
Bhaurao Devras was a brother of Balasaheb Devras, who
Yes.
was Sarsang Chalak.
He was the
point.
head, and Balasaheb by that time was quite unwell, and Bhauraoji was very sharp. So I got a call in this very building that Bhauraoji wants to see you in Jhandewala Estate, where the RSS building was.
Yeah.
So I went there. So it is a small room, just about this much size. और यहाँ एक पलंग सा पड़ा है, एक कुर्सी है, and Bhauraoji is sitting on the palang in a vest and dhoti type of thing. And I found him to be very sharp and very well informed about whatever was happening and what the government was doing in other ways. So when I came back, and he asked me, actually, he told me one thing which I have not mentioned. He said, "तुम मुझे जानते हो?" मेरी एक something he said about that, there is something special about me. In Hindi he was saying कि मैं किसी को छोड़ता नहीं. मैं एक बार एक आदमी को पकड़ लेता हूँ तो फिर उसको छोड़ता नहीं. मैं तुम्हें छोड़ूंगा नहीं.
हाँ.
मतलब कि
in a अच्छी sense.
in a good sense that I will absorb you in my work and not let you go.
Right.
That is a very important, very good thing. So anyhow we laughed and when I came back I
आजकल के जमाने में कोई कहता है मैं छोड़ता नहीं, साउंड ट्रैक सीबीआई ईडी सिक्योरिटी आपके पीछे आ रहे हैं.
उनका वो नहीं था. उनका तो ये है कि भाई मैं छोड़ता नहीं, मतलब मैं तुम्हारे से काम करवाऊंगा, आरएसएस का काम करवाऊंगा. इज इन दैट सेंस. सो देन ही सेड व्हेन आई केम बैक, रामनाथ जी से क्या बात हुई? मैंने कहा जी वो भाई completely austere living and such in the sense that high thinking कि he is so well informed. ये वो he said यही तो मेरी मुश्किल है. My editor does not know the difference between a good man and a good for nothing man. A phrase he used to use about many times, but a judge also he used it once. So he said भी बात ये है कि अरे छोड़ो ये austere living क्या बकवास है. ये ना मिली के साधु हैं.
Because they don't have the opportunity.
इनको छोकरी नहीं मिली इसलिए ये साधु है. जब सत्ता मिलेगी तब तुम देखना ये क्या करेंगे, और सत्ता को लेने के लिए क्या करेंगे, और सत्ता में बैठकर उस सत्ता का क्या सत्ता में क्या क्या नहीं करेंगे. So and that's exactly true.
So today you think Ramnath ji would be vindicated?
Yes, he has been vindicated in my mind, because it is not the RSS of austerity. Even forget Bhaurao Devras, but if you see Golwalkar's speeches about them as to what are the essentials for a Swayam Sevak, you would not find that today.
So this leadership of the RSS, you would say, does not conform to the austere ideal?
Well, actually, there are now two things. There's a distinction to be made. The leadership of the RSS is like Mr. Mohan Bhagwati and others. And the products of the RSS are the ministers and the MPs and MLAs and so on. So, firstly, the The second lot, the persons who have joined politics having been reared from the RSS are like any other politician of any other political party. So they are maybe more skillful in lying, for instance, or more skillful in contriving things like electoral bonds for institutionalizing corruption. But otherwise, they are like anybody else. As far as so they do not represent, there is not the slightest reflection in them, and I can, if you bring anybody together, I will read to them what was prescribed for them by the RSS and what was dinned into them again and again in an infinite number of times in their literature about what a Swayamsevak should be and actually how it contrasts with what they are. The second point about the current RSS leadership, it has no authority at all. In my distant view, Mr. Mohan Bhagwati, he is
less than they had in Vajpayee's times?
No, Mr. Vajpayee had a way of dealing with them without confronting them. But in this case, they just don't matter at all. They are just, if I may use Govindacharya's word for Atalji, कि भाई वो तो मुखौटा है. He's a mask. So I think that this top leadership of the RSS today is just the mask of reasonableness. The agenda is something else which is just stuck in the 1940s.
So when they speak, when Sarsang Chalak delivers his Dashara address, that is sound reasonable.
Sound reasonable. And then this whole redefinition of Hinduism all the time. Everybody who stays here, everybody who has patriotism in his heart, everybody who has the same DNA.
Right.
So no, this is just obfuscation. The real agenda has already been set in the 1940s by Golwalkar and others, and that is the agenda which is being implemented on the ground. So in my view, this leadership at the top of the RSS is not the one that controls the RSS. The second rung of the leadership is all now Mr. Modi's paratroopers. They are his instruments. They are not the instruments of the head of the RSS. So in that sense, there's a great shift in the balance within the organization.
So you've talked a great deal about Zail Singh. Looks like you really enjoyed his company. So you people should read all those passages, including one where Zail Singh welcomes him by saying कि तुम बड़े बेकार आदमी हो. सर बताइए आप क्यों बेकार हैं?
वो कहता तेनू कुड़ी नहीं चाहिए, तू शराब दी तेनू आदन दी तेनू पैसा ज़्यादा नहीं चाहिए, तो फिर भी तेरा प्रयोग की होएगा? Then you will be quite useless to everybody.
Yeah. So read those passages.
Actually, this is the delight of many of them, and now I don't know the politicians, but the delight of so many of them, of meeting them, was that they were from the earth.
Right.
And their language, their similes, their way of looking at things, it was a delight to meet them.
Isn't Mr. Modi from the earth also?
But probably too sophisticated by now, too polished by now, so that we don't see that.
So what difference do you see? And I'll not hold you longer. I know that we can talk for hours. What difference do you see between Mr. Modi as you know him in Gujarat and now? And what has surprised you and what has not surprised you?
Actually, nothing should have surprised me by now, because it is the Gujarat model. For instance, dressing up facts. If you examine the actual record in Gujarat, it was very different from what we believed at that time. And similarly,
But were you wrong to have bought into it then?
Yes, of course. I had not examined the matter at all. Just as I had not examined the matter of VP Singh.
Right.
VP Singh's record. These two great mistakes. And it's a lesson for the future for all of us, that before we, sometimes we get so upset with the present situation, whichever the present situation is, that we lunge for anybody who will be an alternative.
To be delivering us out of it.
So we should really examine this. And I've quoted an instance in this book when VP Singh had resigned or been made to resign from Rajiv Gandhi's government, and he became the hero at that time, and we were giving him a lot of publicity in the paper. Joe Ramaswamy rang up. He had a great regard for Chandrasekhar. He said that Chandrasekhar has asked me to ring you up, that tell your friend that he is giving this publicity to VP Singh, and VP Singh is a thoroughly dishonest man. He will let down the country, and you tell your friend to stop it. So I said, Joe, there is a Russian proverb that when your house is on fire, you can't wait for Ganga Jal, for Ganges water. You have to do with municipal water. Joe said, but are you sure it is not petrol? So it is a very important thing that we should remember for all the alternatives that we think of. And as to whether and today there are no institutional restraints. Because without altering the constitution, etc., just by packing it a particular type in all institutions, the change has been brought about. So that the citizen does not have any recourse one way or the other.
So which was a bigger error of judgment, VP Singh or Narendra Modi?
I think because Mr. Modi will last much longer, this will be a much more consequential error.
So before I let you go, you have much advice for journalists in the book, and I hope they will all read it and take it seriously. But there is a question that all of us face. We are the generation after you. We are your proteges. People like these who work with us, that how do you relate to politicians, to the powers that be? So one view is that, you should meet them, you should learn, you should keep your own sanity, etc. But don't avoid them. The other is the puritanical view today, which is that if you do source-based journalism, contact-based journalism, if you know too many people, if too many people know you, too much familiarity develops. So sit in your bunker and keep firing. How does one deal with this?
No, I think, of course, we have to meet politicians, we have to get to know them. But generally speaking, I would not put much store by what any source tells anybody. The source is useful only for giving us a hint कि भाई electoral bonds की issue या फलानी चीज़ की issue वो उसको examine कर लो, उसमें बहुत माल है. There'll be a good story in that, to that extent.
But to the extent that because you know somebody, then you feel awkward having
to write about them. Therefore, one should never get too familiar with any one of them, whether it is businessmen or people who are the establishment. You can't be familiar with them.
Yeah, but you can't stay away.
That also one cannot be complete, because you have to get information, and very often good information will come from a rival of that person in the same establishment.
Because if you were not meeting these politicians, this book would not be 1/3 its length and 1/10 as much fun. Because they are much more fun than us.
But there is another point, if I may say so, and maybe your viewers can access it in the way we could not. You see, these days, if you see in the PBS, in YouTube, go to YouTube, and in this public broadcasting system, PBS channel, it's probably an American channel.
American, yes.
Yes. And in that, you will see a thing called Frontline. There's a set of investigations or stories. And in that, just ask for the Putin files. And in those are interviews with the person. You don't even see who the person is interviewing. You just see this lady or some person, a man speaking. The question is asked and then the person gives. One thing, there are several persons there, but one is Julia Ioffe, either Ioffe or Loffe, Ioffe. Please, all journalists should look at that segment. Maybe it is 45 minutes or 1 hour, 25 minutes. Of all of them. Just see how well informed that person is. How well it's amazing. So much detail about Putin's life, about characteristics, about other persons and so on. We should be like that. We must be authorities on that subject, and that does not come from knowing politicians, being close to Putin or anybody else, but actually being distant from and then getting information from many persons without being familiar with anybody. I think that's a very important lesson.
Because that's the reason we keep saying, even on our mugs, because politics matters.
Yes.
Because politics is very important for us.
Yes, we must do that. And similarly, reading documents. It is good that some politician gives you a document. Always remember, it may be he's trying to push something into your lap. But otherwise, we must learn to read the documents. And very often it happens that in search for a document which is so-called secret, we fail to read what is available in the public record, what is published. So we must learn to do that. One of the great examples for journalism was Mr. I.F. Stone. He was nearly blind, he was almost deaf, and he ran with his wife a thing called I.F. Stone's Weekly. And it turned out that he had never met a president of the United States, he said, since Franklin Roosevelt. But he was always right on in telling you what is happening in the Vietnam War and what is going to happen and what the government is trying to hide and what the facts are. Why? Because he was reading their press releases, but carefully. What are they concealing? What are they trying to mislead you into? So read the printed document. So in that sense, I think this business of source journalism is an overplayed thing in journalism.
Right. So I think on that note of sage advice, we'll conclude this. As you might have figured, we can go on talking for hours and hours, but Arun's time is precious. I am honored to have any time with him. Arun, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And the best to the print always, and to everybody here.
Thank you,
It's
sir.
a delight to be here.
The Print off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in alliance with Jindal Steel and Power Limited and Indraprastha Polo Hospitals, airline partner SpiceJet.